Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Natural Nutrition. I'm your host, Sammy Williams, and today I'm going to take you on a journey into the world of type 2 diabetes and carbohydrate. So here's the show. The statistics on type 2 diabetes are pretty shocking. In the UK alone, around 5 million people are currently suffering with the symptoms of type 2 diabetes. And I must just make a quick distinction there, because type 2 diabetes is a dietary-related disease, whereas type 1 diabetes is a disease which people are either born with or they develop as they get older. But it's not because of dietary choices that they've made. So type 2 diabetes is the type of diabetes that I'm going to be talking about throughout this podcast. According to the World Health Organization, in 1990, there were around 108 million people suffering with diabetes globally. And since then, that has rose to around 420 million people in only 30 years. That's crazy. I was born in 1981, and since then, in my lifetime, it's risen by around 300 million people. And it's one of the only non-communicable diseases which has actually increased in its prevalence. Diseases like heart attacks, cardiovascular disease, they've actually gone down in their prevalence, whereas diabetes is increasing. So this is a huge problem, and it's not just a problem that affects westernized countries, it's a problem that affects low to middle income countries, and in fact the numbers there are increasing even more than they were before. So this is a huge issue, and it's something that is also quite close to my heart. The reason for that is because it actually happened to my dad. And before I go on to talk a little bit about what type 2 diabetes is, I'm just going to tell you a story. So when I was living in Thailand back in 2020, this was around COVID times, and I had decided to leave my teaching position in Bangkok. So I used to be a biology teacher, and I lived in Bangkok for 3 years, and I worked at an international school there. But I decided that I wanted to leave teaching and I wanted to go into nutrition. And so I had already left my job before COVID happened. The end of the school year came in June, and I decided to stay in Thailand for a few more months before I started my master's in nutrition. So during that time, I basically lived on an island called Koh Phangan, which is actually where I am right now. And I stayed here for about 6 months, and then I decided to go back home in December 2020, back to the UK. On arriving in the UK, I saw my dad for the first time in about 12 months. Because of COVID, obviously, we'd not been traveling. So I was really surprised when I saw him. I was actually shocked by the change that had happened to him, because he's a very slim, fit, and active person. But he looked puffy in his face, his eyes were bloodshot. He was often getting very sleepy and tired. And this was actually an indication that there was something going on metabolically in his body. And I wasn't actually a nutritionist at the time, but I was very interested in nutrition. And also from teaching biology, I had often taught about type 2 diabetes to the children when we talked about digestion and nutrition and everything. And I could recognize some of the symptoms. And it was later on when I sort of observed him eating that I realized what was potentially causing this. And he'd always been a fan of desserts, kind of the old-fashioned types of desserts like, treacle pudding and custard and all that kind of stuff. I observed him every evening eating these little pots of, treacle puddings and chocolate puddings that he would heat up in the microwave, and then he would have custard over the top of them. And I sort of had a look at one of the packets, and I realized that actually he was consuming between like 30 to 40 grams of sugar. And often he would have these quite late in the evening as well, around maybe sort of like 9 o'clock. And actually this time in the day is a time when your body is much less able to process sugar. You're actually more insulin resistant in the evening than you are in the morning. And so I discussed this with him, and he ended up going for a blood test eventually. And it did show that he was pre-diabetic. And so this was another time really that helped to motivate me and enthuse me to help other people in a situation, because I always feel like these sorts of diseases can affect anyone. It's not just people who maybe are overweight or people in underdeveloped countries or people in deprived areas, they affect all types of people. And there really is a lack of knowledge and understanding around this. So what actually is type 2 diabetes? Well, type 2 diabetes is a chronic condition which affects an organ in the body called the pancreas. Now, the pancreas secretes several hormones, and one of those hormones is insulin. And I'm sure most of you have heard of insulin because it is commonly talked about now. But insulin is the hormone which is secreted when you eat a meal. It goes into the blood and it attaches to the glucose or the sugar in the blood, and it removes it from the blood pretty quickly, actually. If you've ever worn one of those continuous glucose monitors on your arm and tracked your blood sugar responses after meals, you will see how quickly it can go down. And so in somebody that has type 2 diabetes, what happens is that the pancreas is either not secreting enough insulin, or the insulin that it is secreting is actually not functioning correctly. And so what can happen is that the sugar or the glucose can stay in the blood for a lot longer than it should. And the reason why this is dangerous is because it damages the lining of the blood vessels and also the nerves as well in the body. And so if this situation is left uncontrolled, and if it happens day after day after day, it can lead to problems with vision. So blindness is actually a problem or can be caused by type 2 diabetes. And it can cause lots of other metabolic dysregulation in the body. So what I mean by that is things like inflammation can happen in the body as well. And also that can be related to other elements of the diet. So type 2 diabetes is like an insidious condition which can creep up on you quite slowly. And lots of people may be living with what's called pre-diabetes, which is just before you become diabetic. And this is where your insulin becomes resistant. So you are insulin resistant, which means that you are not able to respond properly to the insulin that is being secreted into the blood. So this is definitely a condition which needs to be talked about more. And I think if you are experiencing any symptoms of this, which are things like fatigue, particularly after eating a meal, if you're feeling thirsty often, if you're urinating often, if you're craving sugar or carbohydrate-filled meals as well, these can all be signs that you might be having some symptoms of insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. And this can lead to type 2 diabetes if it's left uncontrolled or untreated. So what causes diabetes? What causes type 2 diabetes? Well, usually it is the over intake or the excessive intake of refined carbohydrates and also ultra processed or highly processed foods. When I've been traveling, I went traveling at the end of last year, and I was lucky enough to go to Nepal. And one of the places that we went to was up in the Himalayas, and we were trekking, and in all of the shops that were there, the tea houses, there was this abundance of ultra processed food. Now, I understand that obviously it's quite a difficult environment there and fresh food is quite hard to grow, but this isn't the only place that I've seen this. I've also seen this in countries like India, where I went to afterwards. I've seen it in my own country, in the UK. I've seen it in Thailand and other countries in Asia where I've traveled. And the availability of ultra processed foods is huge. It's much, much more difficult to get a banana or an apple than it is to get a chocolate bar or a packet of crisps. And I think this is probably one of the biggest contributors to the increase of diabetes in low and middle income countries. So this was one of the other things that really shocked me, I guess, into thinking that I wanted to specialize in the metabolic problems that people have through diet. And that's another thing that I would like to emphasize here, is that type 2 diabetes is a preventable disease. It's not a disease that you are born with. It's not to do with your genetics particularly, although epigenetics can contribute, but we'll talk about that in a different podcast. And it is reversible as well. And that's really such an empowering thing to know, is that if you are suffering with any of these symptoms, you can reverse it. You have got the ability, the opportunity to do that. And so I would really encourage you to explore ways that you can do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So one of the other problems with diabetes is that when people get diagnosed with prediabetes or insulin resistance, they usually get diagnosed by their GP. And as we've probably all heard in the media, GPs don't get a lot of training on nutrition. As this is a dietary related disease, it makes sense to me to, rather than, mask it over with medication, which only deals with the symptoms, is to actually look at the root cause of what is causing the diabetes or the insulin resistance in the first place. And generally, the advice that is given to most people, and the advice that was given to my dad as well when he had his diagnosis, was to stop eating carbohydrates, to literally cut carbohydrates completely out of your diet. And subsequently, I have learned that that is terrible advice to give to somebody with diabetes. And I'm going to explain to you now the reasons why that is not good advice. So one of the main reasons is that carbohydrates, there's lots of different carbohydrates. And one of the ones which actually we need to be eating more of in our society is fiber. So fiber is a type of carbohydrate. And there are also other different types of fibers as well. But we'll just talk generally about fiber. So why do we need to eat fiber? Well, fiber contains, there's two types actually. There's soluble and insoluble. That's a very sort of general definition. And we need to eat both types. The reasons why: it helps us to move food through our digestive system. So it acts a little bit like an internal brush. It helps to move things through. So that means that you can go to the toilet regularly, which is a sign of digestive health. You're not constipated, and you don't have diarrhea either. Fiber also fills you up and makes you satisfied. So when you eat a meal that's full of fiber, you actually stay full for longer. So it's more satiating. Another reason is that fiber actually helps you to control your blood sugar level. So if you eat a fibrous meal, it actually slows down the absorption of glucose into the blood. And actually slows down or attenuates your blood sugar response, which is really important. And so by telling people to cut out carbohydrates, they're cutting out this whole food group, which is actually essential for overall health. We're actually supposed to eat around 30 grams. The recommendation is around 30 grams of fiber per day. The majority of people in the UK eat between 10 to 15 grams per day. And so the amount of fiber that people are consuming is way, way lower than it should be. This is a problem. So I would suggest that rather than telling people to stop eating carbohydrates, which is a very generic bit of advice to give, is to stop telling people to eat refined carbohydrates and ultra and high processed foods. So what I mean by that is refined carbohydrates are things like sugar, so any sugars that have been added, so whether that's glucose or fructose. And what I mean by added is that they are free sugars, so they're sugars that are not already inside the food. So fructose is something that comes up quite often in our in media and social media and things like that. You shouldn't eat too much fruit because it's got sugar in it. And yes, that's right. You shouldn't eat too much fruit, but you still should eat some fruit. So fruit contains sugar, but it's what we call intrinsic sugar. So it's sugar that is already inside the food. And that means that your body has to actually digest it first to liberate the sugar before it's absorbed. And so the fiber in the fruit, like I mentioned before, slows down that absorption. So the other reason why fruit is good, because it contains lots of other vitamins and minerals and micronutrients as well as water. And actually we get quite a lot of our water intake from food rather than just from drinking. So fruit is something that you should definitely be including in your diet. If you have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, I would recommend choosing low sugar fruits, such as berries. So berries are a great way to get lots of antioxidants in, which also help to reduce inflammation, as well as all the vitamins and minerals from the fruits and the fiber as well. without elevating the blood sugar level too high. Another really important source of fiber are things like beans and pulses. So beans and pulses have been shown to have so many health benefits for you. They help to regulate your blood sugar, like I said before, with fiber, and they also contain proteins as well. And so if you are reducing the amount of meats that you're taking in and increasing your plant-based intake, helping to sort of bulk up your food and your diet with beans and pulses is really, really important. Other good sources of fiber are things like nuts and seeds, as well as vegetables. So I would always recommend to the clients that I work with who have metabolic syndrome, which prediabetes is one of the symptoms of, they have an 80% plant-based diet, which has a foundation in nuts, seeds, whole grains as well, and I'll talk about those in a second, and fruits and vegetables. Now, whole grains are types of carbohydrates, but they don't come under the refined carbohydrates umbrella. So whole grains are things like brown rice, quinoa, bulgur wheat. They are the whole grain. They haven't been refined. They haven't been changed in any way. A carbohydrate that has been highly processed would be something like the white flour that you find in breads and cakes and pastries and things like that. So reducing the intake of those is very important for somebody with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. Another thing that is really common that I found with some clients that I've worked with is that they have tried to go on the keto diet as part of a way to reduce their blood sugar control and actually improve that. So this is also not a great idea. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people that would disagree with me on this, but the keto diet, in my experience and my knowledge that I've read about, is a high fat diet. And it was actually developed for people with epilepsy years ago. And rather than it being a low carbohydrate diet, it's actually a high saturated fat diet. A few years ago, I was completely vegan, and I actually tried to do a keto diet, a vegan keto diet, and it was really difficult to eat a variety of things. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I found it quite challenging. And so what happens is that you end up eating large quantities of animal products which contain high saturated fat. The reason why eating a high saturated fat diet isn't good for you if you have pre-diabetes is that it actually affects your insulin resistance. It actually increases insulin resistance, and it stops you being so sensitive to the insulin that you're eating. And so this can actually make your blood sugar level much higher than it should be. And so I've seen this with one client in particular who actually was on the keto diet before he started working with me. And then he did 1 week of the diet, basically a detox diet, which I put together, including lots of plant-based foods. And within 1 week, he saw his average blood sugar going down from 8.1 millimoles per litre to 6.1 millimoles per litre. That is a huge difference in just 1 week. And that's because he stopped eating the saturated fat, the high saturated fat diet, the animal products, and he started eating a plant-based diet. And it was specifically designed for somebody with pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So I know there are lots of people out there who promote the keto diet and say that it's really good for helping with diabetes, but I would hugely disagree with that statement. And I would always encourage people to cut out refined carbohydrates and cut out ultra-processed and highly processed foods, but to include carbohydrates, which are whole grains, which have been unrefined, so that you're consuming as much fiber as you can. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the foods that you should be eating. So a few other tips of advice for you if you are suffering with pre or type 2 diabetes is to increase your movement. Now, I'm not telling you to go down the gym, to start working out, to take up something or sport that you don't enjoy. What I would really encourage you to do is to find an activity that you enjoy, whether it's walking or sailing or playing tennis, whatever it is, something that you enjoy that gives you pleasure. And the reason that I say that is because you've got to stick to it. It's got to be a lifestyle change. It's got to be something that is going to feed you emotionally and spiritually and give you pleasure so that you want to keep doing it more and more and more. Because if that's not the case, you're never going to stick to it. And it's just going to be another gym membership that you stuck to for 2 months and then you had to cancel. So find movement that you enjoy and try and do that as regularly as you can. I would recommend 30 minutes a day of movement, even if that includes walking up and down the stairs, at work, on your lunch break, going out for a 10-15 minute walk after you've eaten, which actually does also help to regulate your blood sugar. Another thing I would recommend you doing is educating yourself around what types of foods you can be eating. So there's lots of information these days on the internet about how to incorporate plant-based foods into your diet, how to eat whole plant-based foods, so things that contain whole grains and whole foods, like I mentioned earlier, and start to do a little bit of educating yourself around that, even if it's listening to a 20-30 minute podcast once a week. All of these things are going to help you to feel more empowered and more able to actually make changes for yourself. Another thing I would suggest is potentially investing in a nutritionist. So somebody who is able to help you specifically with your problem and then, help you and teach you ways that you can actually improve your diet so that it's a sustainable change. I'm not talking about a diet. I'm not talking about going on a low calorie diet where you're cutting lots of foods out. I'm talking about teaching you how to alter your nutritional intake from where it is now to a new way of eating that will sustain you for the rest of your life. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. I really hope you've enjoyed it and you found the content interesting. If you have any comments or suggestions, please drop me a message. You can reach me on Instagram at natural.nut_, or you can find me on Facebook, Natural Nutrition, or you can visit my website, which is www.naturalnut.co.uk. And on there, you can send me a message and I will do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. If you're interested in working with me, then please also visit my website where you can book a free discovery call with me and we can just discuss your needs and see if we can work together to get you to a better place of health. My name's Sammy and this has been Natural Nutrition. Take care. Have a great day.